Episode 9 of Life on Earth is called Rise of the Mammals, and it's obviously about mammals. Specifically, the early mammals. Monotremes and marsupials are the main focus of this episode, and this episode opens up with Attenborough holding a platypus. So this is actually quite a really good sequence. It's Attenborough holding this platypus and using it to describe the early kinds of mammals. They obviously lay eggs, but they're very obviously mammals. They've got hair, they produce milk, and they obviously use that milk to rear their young. And it's actually quite fun watching the platypus just swim about in the water. That is not something I think that had been seen before, and it's actually not something you've seen that often since. They did actually want to film a platypus giving birth and illustrate how it cares for its young at that stage in its development. However, they weren't able to film that. It wasn't until 2002 when Life of Mammals came out when they were actually able to show that on screen, but it was still really good. And then we talk about the echidna, and we're actually able to get footage of echidnas, giving birth and looking after the young. We see the baby echidna is essentially like a little jelly bean that hides in a little pouch, and it basically sweats milk much like the platypus, which then collects in this pouch, and the young are able to feed off that. And that's interesting. Obviously, monotremes are the most primitive forms of mammals. There were probably quite a lot of monotremes around in the time of the dinosaurs. And then we start talking about fossils, and specifically what the earliest forerunners of mammals were. The pelycosaurs were the earliest animals that we'd consider to be the forerunners of mammals. Dimetrodon's highlighted as an example. We actually see from its skull there is an element of, you can see how it got to mammals. Its jaws and teeth are more in line with what eventually would appear in mammals. And then we see various skulls of other prehistoric therapsids, various gorgonopsids and cynodonts, which obviously led to mammals. And while the first mammals were able to generate their own heat, a forerunner of that is in Dimetrodon with the sails. But that was obviously taken to much more extreme in their descendants, which obviously include us. And in order to preserve that heat, they developed hair to kind of lock it in. That was interesting. It's also something I'd thought about before. And we highlighted the earliest mammals that were around at the time of the dinosaurs were small insect-eating animals, kind of things like shrews and hedgehogs. And then we look at the main focus of this episode, which is marsupials. So we go to North America and we look at opossums. We highlight how they have a pouch. They obviously give birth to partially formed young, which make their way into this pouch where there's nipples, and they're able to just feed on that until they get to a point where they're able to leave the pouch if they're strong enough. We highlight various opossums across South America in particular, and they're all kind of similar. They have kind of similar niches. They're mostly arboreal, but there are variations in that. The yapok's probably the most unique one. It's a species of opossum that lives in the water and eats fish, but they're all kind of similar. Some of them have got pouches, some of them don't. Some of the smaller species, the kind of mouse-like opossums, just have young that cling to their bellies where they've got nipples. I highlight how the majority of marsupials are actually found in Australia. So while it's very likely that marsupials evolved in North America, or at least there was a significant variation of them there, they were still able to get to Australia because the continents were still kind of together, like Antarctica and Australia, and the bottom of South America was pretty much attached. They were able to get across Antarctica to get to Australia. All the ones in Antarctica obviously died out as it travelled further south, as did all the terrestrial animals pretty much there. But in Australia they were able to flourish, and we highlight the Australian equivalent of the American opossums, the possums. And again, while there's a wide variety of them, they are kind of similar to the ones you find in South America. A lot of them are mouse-like. The very small ones tend not to have pouches, but the bigger ones do. Some of them feed on nectar, some of them feed on leaves, some of them feed on insects. Some of them are able to take insects much larger than themselves. And we see one species actually giving birth and looking after its young. It's quite a good sequence. I like that. There's a few sequences like that in this episode. Obviously the echidna was like that. There's more interesting ones as the episode goes on, but that was quite cool. And then we start looking at larger marsupials. The koala was highlighted as a sort of medium cat-sized predator, which feeds on the smaller possums. And the Tasmanian devil's obviously the most famous one alive today. We see the Tasmanian devil approaching a carcass, and the much smaller quoll sees it and basically shits itself and scampers off. That was quite funny. And we see the Tasmanian devils just tearing into this carcass. It's actually quite cool seeing them. I don't know how common they'd been seen at this point, so that was quite interesting. I like that. And then it obviously leads us into the thylacine. It's obviously the same footage of the thylacine that we see today, but Attenborough uses the thylacine as a very good example of convergent evolution. So obviously, the vast majority of Australian marsupials are kind of similar to some placental mammals we find in other parts of the world. Thylacine is obviously very similar to wolves, but it's obviously not related to them closely. And we highlight various other examples of that. The numbat is kind of highlighted as being a bit like a pangolin. The sugar glider is a very good example of one that's like the flying squirrel. We get some footage of the sugar gliders climbing trees and then gliding, which is obviously something that was more commonly associated with flying squirrels at the time. But then we start to look at where some of the convergent evolution similarities kind of diverge a little bit. Like koalas are a good example, because koalas are kind of similar to sloths in a certain way, in the sense that they live in trees, are very slow moving, very lazy, and they only feed on specific types of leaves. However, a koala obviously looks very different from a sloth. The wombat doesn't really look that much like any other types of animals. Attenborough says it's kind of like a marmot, but not really. There's quite a funny bit of a hairy-nosed wombat getting some dirt shoveled into its face, and Attenborough says, yeah, they're not actually that intelligent, and it just kind of looks at the camera quite gormlessly. It's quite funny, I enjoyed that. And the honey possum is a species of marsupial that isn't really like any other type of mammal. It's a small, shrew-like marsupial that feeds almost exclusively on nectar. The only other mammal that's like that is a type of bat. It does show that while there's a lot of convergent evolution going on, there are some marsupials in Australia that are really like nothing else out there. And they highlight the potteroo, which is quite a small marsupial, which you wouldn't really think of being like a kangaroo. However, it does hop on two legs, and it carries its young in its pouch while it hops, which is very similar to a kangaroo. That obviously leads us into wallabies, and wallabies are quite good. You see various types of wallabies. They obviously are highlighted as being like small kangaroos. Tree kangaroos, we see them briefly. It's interesting because they look very ill-equipped to live in the trees. Like, they do clearly look like wallabies. Because they live in a part of the world where there aren't any other arboreal mammals, they've kind of got that place to themselves. Amber suggests that maybe they just didn't need to evolve to be as specialised as things like monkeys or some of the tree anteaters. And then we go to this cave in Australia, like near Adelaide, where there's large deposits of bones of various prehistoric marsupials, which have been washed there by rivers. And it's interesting to see the wide variety of extinct species. We see the skulls of Procoptodon, the giant kangaroo, Diprotodon, which is obviously a very large relative of the wombat, and we see the marsupial lion skull as well. We highlight how it is very weird. It was obviously closely related to wombats and koalas, but it looks so strange. Like, it is very far from pretty much most large mammal carnivores that are of the placental variation. It had one axe-like tooth at the back of its mouth to just slice through prey, and obviously its front two teeth were, pretty pronounced, and they were obviously capable of doing some pretty large damage. That was interesting. And then we spend the rest of the marsupial part of the episode talking about kangaroos. You just see them hopping around in the desert and arid grasslands. They highlight how Australia, as it drifted further north, became more arid, and animals like kangaroos were able to get a proper foothold in. We highlight their desert adaptations. They lick themselves with saliva, and as that evaporates, it cools them down. We see a kangaroo giving birth, and that's interesting. It's this little jelly bean-like kangaroo that's got pretty pronounced forearms, much like the possums we saw earlier, but it is able to crawl up its mum's belly into the pouch where it's got a nipple, suckles on it, and we highlight the reproductive behaviour of kangaroos. Now, it's very interesting. So basically, they'll have a joey that's obviously quite big, and it's able to go and forage for itself, but it still comes back to its mum for milk. At the same time, they will have a jelly bean-sized baby, suckling away, getting larger, in the same pouch on a different nipple, and at the same time, they're able to retain a fertilised egg within themselves that will be held in stasis until the opportune moment. And that is interesting. It's something you don't really think about, but it's actually quite a unique thing that marsupials have, and it's really beneficial for kangaroos. We highlight how kangaroos are, obviously the most famous marsupials, but they're pretty developed, they're pretty advanced. They're obviously not as fast as some of the faster antelope species, but they are able to travel quite quickly. They don't really need to be much faster than they are, to be fair. And Amber does a good job of ending the marsupial sequence by talking about how developed they actually are. I think people tend to think of marsupials as a bit backward because you don't find them anywhere else in the world, but that model of giving birth to a very small baby that lives in a pouch and continues its development there is something that the marsupials have really played around with. Kangaroos are maybe the apex of that, and the advantages of the way the kangaroo reproduces by having 3 offspring on the go at the same time, essentially, is something that placentals just can't do. So that's maybe something they have over us. It's an interesting angle to take because it's not something I think you'd usually think to take, and it, gave marsupials the respect they deserve. And the last bit of the episode focuses on placental mammals. We highlight through the Solenodon of all mammals. That was an interesting choice. We highlight how they obviously have a placenta, they are able to nurture the young within the body and give birth to live young, which is a bit more developed, and in a lot of cases they're able to pretty much, move from the go. We see various mammals giving birth, like rabbits, wildebeest, and we end the episode with harp seals. So harp seals obviously live in the Arctic, which is somewhere that our reptile ancestors could never live, and their milk is obviously very fatty and very nutritious because their young have got to deal with the cold. Amber just basically highlights this. We'll sit next to harp seal pup, which obviously is very cute, and that's pretty much how we end the episode. I think that was a good way of ending it, and now that we've got the various reproductive strategies that mammals use, we're able to be a bit more free in the way they discuss mammals in the next few episodes, so that's quite good. So yeah, this episode is a pretty good episode. I think it's good, it's pretty contained. I think the other ones obviously cover a pretty massive variety of animals, obviously because the whole group's covered. This episode is a bit more focused on, specifically marsupials mainly, but a bit of monotremes and a little bit on placentals. But I think it works, it's pretty good. And so yeah, I like this one. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, what you think of this episode. Let me know, and I'll be doing the next one next week, which continues to be about mammals of various sorts, so look forward to that. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to, it's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.